So Lab Storymasters is a specialty club with a focus on humor and storytelling. We meet once per month, and this year, 23-24 program year, well, extending actually a little beyond 2024 into 2025, we are doing kind of a 12 months worth of meetings that are a learning experience for all of our members about a deep dive into storytelling with focusing on one or more aspects of specific storytelling per month. So we've had how to use conflict, how to build humor. Tonight, we are focused specifically on bringing characters to life. I think last month we did how to add visual effects, how to add sound effects, and how to make the most use of those so that we can really take a deep dive into all of those skills that help us be better storytellers and add humor, which I'm really excited about because I'm learning so much being a club member. And I always know when I need to step up into a role because I think as we're discussing it, I'm a little nervous to do that. I don't think I'm ready for that. An example is tonight. Luckily, I spoke last month, so didn't have to show all my ignorance about how to bring a character to life for this month because we have some fabulous panelists ready to join us for this evening. So we, as a specialty club and somewhat as an advanced club, we'd like our members to have had some experience in Toastmasters. So we have dropped some of the more common rules. We don't often do all counter, grammarian, or have table topics, although we do have a chance for participation from all of our guests at one point, members and guests at one point or another. We do have timer. Sometimes we have evaluators. In fact, frequently a speaker will have 3 evaluators per speech. Tonight we're doing a panel. One of the nice things about being an advanced club is we can mix it up a bit. We have 4 panelists for tonight. And we have our timer, Cynthia here. Cynthia, what will the panelists see as they're doing their speaking portion of our meeting?
All right. And when they get to their green portion, which is going to be at 5, 7, or 10 respectively, I will change my background to green. When they get to the yellow portion, which is going to be 6, 8, or 11 respectively, I will change my background to yellow. And when they hit time's up, which is going to be 7, 9, or 12, I will turn it red.
Excellent, efficient timing display. Thank you for that. I will serve not only as kind of the Toastmaster of the day, but I will also be your panel moderator and manage us through the question and answer portion of our meeting tonight. Let's begin, shall we? We have an exciting group of speakers tonight. Some of them you may be more familiar with than others. This is the first time I've had a chance to meet Christopher. He will be speaking third. So our first speaker tonight is club member Phil Pearson. Phil is speaking from the Engaging Humor Pathway, Level 1, Writing a Speech with Purpose. While serving in the Army, working for the state of Washington, and participating in Toastmasters have all presented Phil with opportunities to make new friends. And like most people, some friendships quickly and easily. Other friendship, not so much. Tonight, Phil shares his experience developing a couple of his most recent friendships. Please join me in welcoming Making new friends. Phil Pearson.
Ring. Hey, Dad. Hey, Andrew. Yeah? That surgery on my ankle finally got scheduled. The thing is, I'm going to be off of my feet for at least 3 weeks. Ladies and gentlemen, you never quite give up being a parent. I'm here to tell you. And when that call came, I said to myself, there's only one thing I need to do, and that's go stay with my son Andrew, who lives in Bramerton, about an hour away from our house. We spoke a little bit more on the phone, and I found out that Andrew now has 2 roommates. I said, Andrew, is there going to be room for me at your house with your 2 roommates? Oh, Dad, don't worry about it. You'll love them. You'll get along just fine. Well, the day came. It was not to be trite or anything, but it was a dark and stormy night when I went to Bramerton. And I got there, got my load of stuff out of the car, went to the door. Already I could hear a commotion in that apartment. Loud, thumping around. What is going on? A party? Andrew, I'm here. Just a minute. I'll be right there. I hear the door unlock, and I'm invited in. Suddenly, two of his roommates came storming to the door. Boom! Big gregarious hug by the first one. Now, that first roommate was all up in my face. Oh, I'm so glad to meet you. How was your trip? Tell me all about it. Have you had dinner yet? And then this other roommate's like, looks at me, gives me the casual sup, and then saunters off to his side of the room. I said, well, those are 2 different roommates. Well, the first gregarious roommate continues to be all up in my face. Now, I'm thinking, dude, a little space would be nice. I don't hardly even know you yet. But he's there. He won't leave me alone. He wants to show me around the apartment, tell me all about his day. The other roommate was like the opposite. He went to the corner of the room and shut down. Like, why are you in my space? Can you keep this noise down? I'm trying to sleep. Well, I get in, unload my stuff. Fortunately, he had a little snack for me to have for dinner. We sat down around his table and chatted about his upcoming surgery. Gregarious roommate continues to be like in my space. Finally, I said, dude, I like you. I think I might like you, maybe, but you got to give me some room. The other roommate, I find out the first roommate, his name, Andrew says, Dad, his name's Tank. That's what everybody calls him. And I said, that is a perfect name for that guy. The other roommate, Andrew says, Dad, his name is Marcus. Yeah, he does think he's kind of the Caesar, the king of the castle. But once you get to know him, he'll warm up to you. We had dinner, got to talk about his upcoming surgery, and it came to bedtime. Well, they're kind of, turns out, pretty protective of their space, even for watching movies. Okay, if you're going to sit on the couch, I'm going to sit right next to you, Tank says. Marcus, on the other hand, looks at me and says, no, I'm going to go to the other room. You are not my friend yet. After a while, they both were greeting me. Oh, there's something did I mention that Andrew's roommates are actually dogs? Yeah, Tank is this huge black lab. I mean, he's giant. And he is gregarious like nobody's business. He wants to know everybody. Everybody is a friend. He's never met a stranger, and he wants to be in your face. Marcus is a shorter, stockier Rottweiler who really does think he's the Caesar of that castle. Well, as we got to know each other, it turned out that we were all quite friends. Marcus continued to be a little bit aloof, but when I would take him for walks, he would gently tug me this way and that. And he would do his business in a quite a regal manner, let's say. Tank, on the other hand, was very helpful. Not only would he go on walks, but he would pull me up the hill and then pull me down the hill and then pull me around the loop. Yes, we had a good time and got to know each other quite well during those days. It turns out that Tank really does love everybody. And he turned out to be a very good guard dog and a very good friend. Now Marcus, on the other hand, also became my friend, but he continued to be a little bit aloof, like he was just letting me into his space. So with that, fellow Toastmasters, I've learned that friends come in all shapes and sizes, all colors and species. I got to know Tank and Marcus well during those 3 or 4 weeks staying with Andrew. I thank every day. I thank my lucky stars for meeting these 2 new friends. Madam Toastmaster.
I love it. Thank you so much, Phil. That was wonderful. Please feel free to send some comments to Phil about his speech using the chat. He will, I'm sure, love to hear what you have to say. And I wrote a couple of questions out for Phil that I'll be able to ask during the Q&A portion. So if you have some of those, jot them down also, and then we can ask Phil more about his speech. We'll move on to speaker number 2. This is our Vice President Education and the mastermind behind our year of storytelling and humor, Kyle Hall. Kyle tonight is speaking from the Engaging Humor Path, Introduction to Body Language. We have some things to learn from Kyle tonight about introduction to body language. Sometimes, Kyle says, sometimes the drama and the humor of a situation isn't obvious to the outside world. Sometimes all the excitement is taking place in the inner amusement park, inside the storyteller's mind. How can the teller get that drama and humor out of their inner landscape and place it before the audience? Answering this question and telling us about bringing your thought to life, please join me in welcoming Kyle Hall. Kyle.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you about the evolution of my inner voices. And I'm going to use a story. Now, some of the members of this club have heard my clothing optional hot tub story, and I'm not going to tell you that whole story. We don't have time for me to tell you that whole story. I'm going to take a snippet of it and show you and try to show you how it evolved, because I've been telling this story for many years and it has changed over time. The story more or less starts out with, I get on a bus to go from Seattle to Anacortes so I can take a ferry out to Orcas Island. I'm going to go out to a resort because I'm depressed and I need some time in nature. And I'm going to a little resort called Doe Bay. And I have a flyer on Doe Bay telling me about it. And I picked it mainly because it's got a view of the bay. It's got a beautiful natural setting. It's got inexpensive tent sites, and it had mineral spring fed hot tubs, which sounded really relaxing. And I'm looking at this flyer sitting on the bus, and I see this little picture next to the hot tub. It's a picture of a sign that says clothing optional. Now, the first time I told the story, I went, clothing optional? I don't do clothing optional. And immediately I started this inner dialogue where I was arguing myself. Was I going to take off my clothes and sit in a hot tub, or was I going to wear my bathing suit, or was I going to avoid the hot tub altogether? Could I, would there be tons of naked people around? What would I do? And I described for the audience this inner dialogue that was going on, this argument in my head. And this argument went on for the hour and a quarter, hour and a half bus ride to Anacortes. It was horrible. It completely took over my attempt to get some peace and quiet and inner peace. That's the first version, was me describing the argument in my head. And then I learned the lesson that rather than tell people, you should show people. And in particular, you should do some dialogue. So I did the story again, but this time, clothing optional. I can't do clothing optional. I can't. Well, maybe, I don't know. Maybe I could. Maybe. It might be relaxing. No, but there might be other naked people there. Yeah, but, nudity is not that big a deal. I mean, we make a big deal of the U.S., but it's not that big a deal. But it's way outside my comfort zone. And can I do that? Can I do? Could I do? I don't know. What do we do? What do we do? And that was the type of dialogue that I was doing. Just a little turn here, a little turn here, talking to myself. And I was thinking about this speech, trying to develop it further. And it occurred to me, one of the things I needed to do is I needed to name the voices in my head. And I decided that one of the voices in my head is the Puritan. And the other voice in my head is the dude. And with that in mind, I was able to do the speech and really try to become the two characters. Excuse me. I've got a little bit of an allergy that makes me cough. So I'm sitting on the bus looking at this thing and it says clothing optional. Clothing optional? Clothing optional? The clothing optional are two words that don't belong in the same sentence together. Man, relax. What are you so upset about? Clothing optional? I don't do clothing optional. It's not natural. Oh, come on, man. It's nothing but natural. It's just the human body. There's nothing wrong with it. Just relax, chill out. There might be naked people there. Yeah, you say that like that's a bad thing. I mean, come on, man. It's just, they're not talking about sex. It's just being in a hot tub without the bathing suit. I don't do that. We grew up in New England where the Puritan values soak into the soil and leach up through your feet while you're growing up. We can't do this. Man, you're really freaking out. You're bringing me down, man. You got to relax. Go with the flow. Take a deep breath. Loosen up. The hot tub will really help you do that. It'll really help you do that. Loosen up. What if mother finds out? Oh, man. You really are worried about this, aren't you? Ladies and gentlemen, that was an instance of that argument in my head between the dude and the Puritan. And that's a chunk of a speech about me going to a resort that had a clothing optional hot tub. Now, as I said, I'm not doing the whole speech for you tonight. I am thinking about doing that speech as part of a keynote in April. So if you want to hear the rest of it, if you want to see the whole thing, and actually a longer version than most of you had ever seen before, come in April. But the point I'm making is we often have moments of great drama that only we know about because it's all in here. So how do you get it out in front of an audience so you can have some fun with it? Well, first, work up some of the dialogue, and then look at the dialogue and give the people having the dialogue, give them a name. And once you have a name, you can probably figure out the physical characteristics for them, like the Puritan, uptight, rigid, high voice, and the dude with the long, the long hair and the relaxed and just kind of loose. You can figure out how to represent your characters while you do the dialogue, and you can bring those inner voices to life. Back to you, Madam Toastmaster.
Excellent, Kyle, and I love how you managed that up the progression of like telling us how you created it while kind of giving us hints at the story too, while not the whole thing. But thank you. I learned a lot from listening to you. Looking forward to, again, the Q&A. If you have comments for Kyle, please put them in the chat. Please note your questions out, and we will have a chance to, as with Phil, talk to Kyle during the Q&A portion of our meeting. That was our second of our 4 speakers. Guest speaker, Christopher Summit, so his first visit to our club, is going to be talking to us about bringing the inanimate to life. Christopher has been a Toastmaster and has given the Boeing Everett factory tour for the past 15 years. The storyteller challenges of his job means giving a 90-minute presentation to 30 to 40 guests from all backgrounds, ages, geographies, and I'm going to guess languages, probably many of whom English is not their primary. And you all know when we're speaking with an audience for whom English is not the primary, if you use a lot of idioms or cultural references, not necessarily going to be understood. So you have to think about all of that. The Boeing factory is the largest volume building on Earth and a constantly changing inner landscape of technical and industrial visuals. It's such an overwhelming maze of steel, tools, aircraft, and people that one has to give those elements character to make it interpretively memorable for a non-technical audience. Here telling us about bringing the inanimate to life, join me in welcoming guest panelist Christopher Summit. Christopher.
How do you do, folks? Can everybody hear me? Excellent. I've been doing this 15 years, working in a theater space that's always changing. I'm also on a bus, talking to people and making sure they are seeing what I want them to see. It's as much getting a rapport with that audience right from the beginning. From our first moments in the theater together to when we board the bus, I have to be watching their eyes to see if they're seeing the things, if things are catching their attention the way they're supposed to. I am also a guide storyteller who is also a sheepdog. When you've got 30 or 40 people who aren't factory wise, I have to look out for their safety as well as their attention. Because when you're in a moving bus, what they see is always changing. Your timing is always changing. Not everybody who attends your tour, not everyone in your audience is an aviation geek. You might have a few who love airplanes, and the rest of the audience are the family members who've been dragged along. I used to be one of those as a child. As a child, I saw that whole factory go up. I learned the lore of the place from my father blowing off steam at night when he got home. Now the dad's gone, I can work there with a clean conscience, and I live at the end of the runway the way I always did. So I know my theater space. I know that landscape. I can recognize the jets. I can recognize what's going on inside that vast building. You have to give character to those inanimate things so that they can speak. You do this by looking at their shapes, their colors, their textures, if they're moving, how they're moving. You're never afraid in that factory of being big, moving in broad, large ways. I am never going to upstage that big factory building or that flight line. The only time I have a problem is when nature is against me. Payne Field, where the factory is, was originally chosen because it stayed fog-free for most of the year. What do you as a storyteller do when your visual aid is obscured by fog? Well, this is where we can reach to our past. I'll paraphrase Shakespeare by saying, folks, it's foggy. Suppose within the girdle of Boeing's boundaries are now confined a brace of mighty buildings, whose high, upreared and abutting fronts the narrow Boeing freeway parts asunder. Think when I speak of great aircraft, you see them on the flight line, lifting sharp, proud tails into the receiving air. For now, it's your imagination that must fill this. Far to left, farther to right, unbroken gleams of blue runway lights are threading. This is what you do until we get close enough to the building that the fog parts and they can see what I'm talking about. Which brings us to limiting our technical language. Remember, not all of your audience are aviation geeks. So instead of forward section, I say the head. Instead of ailerons and flaps, I just point to panels. It's got to be simple for everyone to understand. Sometimes how I position myself when we get on the balcony, I'll briefly show you here in my background. This is the balcony on the 4th floor, which is like a cliff. You're looking over it into a vast interior. That factory is like living and working in a giant man-made cave. There, I've given it character. And our giant work bays below us, they're like canyons within that cave. You'd have to go back to the ancient world to find this kind of monumental human activity. I'll go back to our regular background here, but you can see it is so overwhelming when they first open up the elevator doors and step out that you have to quickly regain their attention. I give the jets character. For example, the 767, when it's coming at you head on, the doors for the front landing gear close, but you can see the line where the doors are, and it looks like that 767 is smiling at you. The 767 smiles. 747, that's my daddy's plane. It's got a high forehead, big jowls. I can tell them, for example, years ago when the first 747 was doing its taxiing tests in the low sheds where now the Everett Delivery Center stands. Dad brought me in from elementary school. He said, "You're going to see something today." It was in January, the winter sun was low, when suddenly this shadow passed by us. And it took so long to pass, I couldn't believe its length. Nobody had ever seen a jet that big before. As a storyteller, I draw on nautical things, especially in the sense of giving the jets a feminine character. Our fathers sailing in the ships. For the sailor, his ship was like his mother. You are carried in safety in the womb of that ship. That's why ships are called by she, her. The author Nicholas Montserrat once said that, for example, in Stories of the Sea, you have three elements. All these great sea stories, and I'd say great air stories, have this in common. The crew are the heroes. The only heroine has to be the ship, or in my case, the jet. And the only villain is the cruel sea, or wind and air that are a threat to that crew. I often say when people ask me, why do you refer to the jet as she? Well, I said, look at Star Trek, classic Star Trek. When Captain Kirk was asked by the androids who had taken him and his crew from the Enterprise, and they said, we can give you anything you want. Give us back our ship. And they said, we're not going to do that. But we desire our ship. The ship is not a wish. It is an object. No, said Kirk. The Enterprise is a beautiful lady and we love her. And so with our jets. I end my tours by reminding the audience that a year ago in February, the very last 747 that we will ever make by Boeing took off from the runway that they can see from the bus right there in front of them. It was hull number 1,574. That means 1,500 other 747s have gone before it. Up on the sky deck around me were employees, some of whom had come out of retirement to see this last 747 go. And the big lady came to the end of the runway, and she sat there looking at us for quite a while. And I heard those four engines rise. And she turned and headed off south and lifted away. And I heard the air traffic controller at the South Tower. Over the speakers, you could hear him as he said, "So long, Queen of the Skies, and we thank you." It's like saying farewell to Ma and Pa. That, folks, is my presentation. Madam Toastmaster.
Oh, Christopher, that was awesome. Oh my gosh. Gives me great appreciation for tour guides and all of the effort that you put into it. And it brought back a wonderful memory of my childhood when my mother read a story and was so in awe about the 747. Imagine this, she said, imagine how it's the size of this, which I can't remember what the size was, but just the fact that she was so awestruck by this plane and its vastness that Boeing was going to create. So thank you for both that memory and your wonderful speech. And again, if you have comments for Christopher, please note them. And the any questions you might have, we will call upon you when we're in our panel discussion. So thank you. Ready for our final speaker, our guest speaker, TJ. Our next featured speaker has the accolades of being the first Secretary of State of the new republic that would become the USA, the second Vice President of this republic, the third President of this republic. Not only is he a statesman, but also an inventor, an architect, a farmer, a connoisseur of fine wines, speaks 5 languages, created 3 large personal libraries, can tie an artery and dance the minuet. Above all, he is most proud of being the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, the father of the Declaration of Independence, and founder of the University of Virginia. Please join me in giving a warm Lab Storymasters welcome to Thomas Jefferson.
My dear citizens, as I begin, I must start with 2 gratitudes to offer to you. First of all, thank you for keeping the revolution alive for 248 years. I never thought this experiment would have lasted that long, so much appreciation for that. And thanks for inviting me to this part of the world, which you call the Pacific Northwest. In my time, it was referred to as the Oregon country. And I played a big role in securing that for our republic. The first order of business was to purchase the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon Bonaparte in the year 1803, thereby doubling the size of our republic with a single stroke of my pen. I then sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to go all the way to the Pacific, because what I wanted, what I've always envisioned for this republic, was a republic of liberty like none the world had ever seen. And I wanted this republic to span an entire continent, thereby having ports on 2 different seaboards. Unfortunately, Meriwether Lewis was supposed to provide to me a 3-volume narrative of the people and the plants and all that he found out as he did this journey to the Pacific Ocean. And when he came back after the 3-year expedition, he was like, in your time, the Neil Armstrong of his time. He was being wined and dined, and he suffered from something that I probably should have been more aware of. He was melancholic, or as you would say in your time, manic depressant. And he succumbed to alcohol, and he eventually killed himself. We never got that 3-volume narrative. And I feel responsible that I should have brought him back in. He was my secretary and kept a closer look at him in Washington City. I myself had never ventured to the West. I never ventured more than 50 or 60 miles from where I was born. I never crossed over the Appalachian Mountains, but I was fascinated with the West. I garnered every book on the West and read them. But we were revolutionaries, and my founding framers are also very thankful to you for keeping this revolution alive. I must admit to you right now, I am a very poor public speaker. I could have never spoken to such an esteemed group as you in my day. If I ever tried to talk to any audience, I would stammer and stutter. And by the end of that talk, I had not made myself clear at all. I tried to speak as little publicly as possible. when I was president, I broke precedent from my two predecessors, George Washington and John Adams, very close friends of mine. I was the first one to write my State of the Union address to Congress and give it to a courier who sent it to Washington City. Thereby, in my 8 years as president, I saved $11,500 per annum and 2 weeks of congressional review over those 8 years for each year. Also, I was different in the fact that, and you can recognize this in your day, I wrote my presidential speech and I had somebody else deliver it. In view of some of your more recent and entertaining State of the Union address, I invite you to go back to that modest tradition. Based on my time and looking at your time, I really am not, I'm not qualified to speak to you in your day. I lived from 1743 to 1826. I died on July 4th, 1826. And as a side note, my best friend, John Adams, also died on July 4th, 1826. And no, we weren't in a car accident together. He died in Quincy, Massachusetts, and I died in Monticello back in Virginia. I was on the cusp at my time of the banking revolution. We saw the capital markets starting to take place. During most of my life, we were in barter. We would trade each other something. I would trade some of my wheat for some of your pigs. I would give you a ham for your Christmas table, and you gave me collard greens and chard. We also were on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, and I was so enamored with this Yankees new invention called the cotton gin, Eli Whitney. I thought this was amazing. It was a very tedious and manual process to separate the seed from the cotton plant. And this revolutionized that. But what I didn't see, where there was going to be two very unfavorable outcomes from this. I thought, wow, this is going to hasten the clothing of people. But what it did is it hastened the Industrial Revolution. And now people are no longer living in an agrarian society where they had a small farm where they were self-reliant. They now are going and living in the crowded city under very, very bad situations and circumstances. And the second that I did not see, was this gave slavery a second front in the Old South, particularly Mississippi and Alabama. Well, let me fast forward. We only have a few minutes here. One day, some of my fellow framers came knocking at my door, and they said, Thomas, we want you to write a letter to King George III and tell him we no longer want to be part of his regime. And I said, oh, no. The person you want is James Madison. He's much more learned than I. He's much more precise in his language. He's a much better statesman than I. And they looked at each other quite confused. And they said, we already asked James Madison. He said, you were the guy. And if ever there was somebody poised in history to make a difference, I would say it was me at that time. Speaking 5 languages, I read the ancient philosophers in their original Greek and Latin. I had libraries, which most people did not. I was a privilege. I inherited my father's library. During the War of 1812, when the British burned down the capital and the meager library we had, I gave them my library. And all of a sudden, there I was. Part of the condition was I had to give every single volume. I couldn't keep one back for myself. And after I carted off 11 cart full over to Washington City, I came back to Monticello, and the first time in my life, I was a man without books. So of course I did the rational thing. I started a 3rd library. But after these guys came to me, I sat down and I wrote this letter to King George III. And you can read this in other people's memoirs. They're the ones that said Thomas Jefferson was poised to be the right man at the right time in history. And I wrote this very high-level, lofty letter on 2/3 of the page. And it left the bottom third for the remaining 55 demigods that came along with me fighting this revolution, going about the business of creating this new republic. And they signed it. And of course, you probably have figured this out. That letter is the Declaration of Independence. And if you were to read that document today, you will see how I start off talking about we need to abolish tyranny. And if anybody was a tyrant, it was King George III. Perhaps you know this. In Great Britain, the head of state is also the head of the church. This is why several people jumped on the Mayflower in 1620 and took this very fatal voyage to this new world. Everybody thought this was going to be a disaster. And they came here, and it was for one reason and one reason only. They wanted religious freedom. So here we are. I mean, you get what you get when you have the head of state also being the head of the church. In Great Britain, you get the family values of King Henry VIII. Is that what we want? Probably not. So I write this letter, and I'm writing about abolishing tyranny. And the logical sense was, I also wrote to abolish slavery. And when you see this draft of the Declaration of Independence today, it's pretty much what I wrote in one setting. But when it got reviewed by the Committee of Five, John Adams, Ben Franklin, a couple others, they said, oh, no, Thomas, this is too revolutionary. We can't abolish slavery. This is all part of the Atlantic trade route. This is part of the old world. It's part of the new world. So I had to take that out. But when you read that letter, you'll see a phrase that almost sticks out and is out of place. It became the 35 most revolutionary words that the world had ever seen at that point. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I call it the 3 that statement. And it sits there, and it's for you to look at. And I'll tell you, we birthed this nation in the age of enlightenment. And when you read those words today, all men are created equal, that's not exactly what was meant when I wrote that. Because as you know, women did not have the right to vote back then. And when we look at the word men in literature or in history, it was always the male version of meaning all people, but it didn't mean all people. And if you look at other founding documents, you'll see that Indians were like 1/8 of a human being, and slaves weren't even considered humans until the census came out. And all the slave owners said, hey, we know that money is apportioned by the population. We want our slaves to be counted. So now all of a sudden, 5 slaves became 1 person. So as you can see, women, Indians, and slaves, mostly Black people, were not considered equal men. If James Madison were to write this, he would have said something like, well, we reasonably believe that under certain controlled conditions, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men who have reached a certain station in our society are somewhat in a limited way equal. And so, of course, that would have not had the same panache as this high, lofty words that fit on 2/3 of a paper. And I will mention one last point. There was one of our founding fathers that absolutely loathed King George III. And he wanted to make sure that King George III saw his signature. So he was the first to grab the paper and sign it. And he signs it right in the middle of that blank space in big flamboyant letters, John Hancock. And that signature today has become synonymous with the word signature. Put your John Hancock on that. But basically he was giving King George III the proverbial middle finger. So now every time you see that Declaration of Independence, you're going to know why John Hancock's signature is so big. Well, I see my time has run out. And I must admit this before I go. When I saw Christopher Summit here, I had to do a double take. I thought it was my good friend, Ben Franklin. And I had to look and it's Christopher. Okay. And I was willing to have a great conversation. I'll say this. Ben Franklin was a generation older than most of the founding framers, and we all looked up to him. He was a world-renowned celebrity, and we loved him. So it was great to see you almost, Ben Franklin, but I'm glad to see Christopher Summit as well. And I will turn this back to our illustrious MC for the evening, Mary. I have to go off and do other revolutionary business now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, Vice President, and Secretary. Excellent. Well, what a remarkable set of 4 very unique speakers who shared with us each one a different aspect of bringing your characters to life, which is our theme for the meeting. We get to take a little bit of a break. So I will say it on my clock at 7:21. Let us, Cynthia, if you could give us 5 minutes and show the red at 5 minutes, then we'll know when you see that red to come on back on camera. If you're running away, if you're going to take some kind of a break, then you'll know. If you want to hang around, you're welcome to hang around. Timer. Madam Timer, would you give us 30 minutes for the Q&A session? And if you could give me the green at 28, the yellow at 29, and the red at 30, that would be wonderful. Question actually for Thomas Jefferson. Are you taking questions both as your character and as the developer, the creator of your character as lead?
So I was going to ask you what you guys wanted. I can do both, or I could talk about how to, and I mean, Christopher saw me do a full Chautauqua where you come out as the historical person, you speak for a certain amount of time. And then the middle part is the audience can ask that historical person questions. That's where you really have to do all your studying. I mean, you have to know where people were when you're talking, but when people ask you a question, you need to be able to respond as that character would. And then the third part of the Chautauqua is you come out as yourself and you talk about anything they want to ask you. What was it like to be, why do you pick that character? What do you have to do to prepare? So I can do it either way. I mean, you guys can ask me as Thomas or as Lee, and I'll answer the question either way.
So that lets people know, just if you're going to ask a question, let TJ/LA know
There we go.
what you're asking. So does someone have a question that wants to kick us off for this evening? And as always, I'll just welcome all panelists. If you have an answer, might be directed specifically at you, but if it's not, if you have also something you want to add, feel free to add it. I'm very good at managing time and cutting people off, etc. So let's see. Looks like Thomas Lee has a question.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask a question to Christopher Summit. So when did you first start doing the personification of the objects when you were doing your tour? Did you start at the very first time, or you thought, oh, this is a great idea?
From the very beginning.
Okay.
I've already had a long career in storytelling. My vocation has been to talk to the public. Even when I was in law enforcement in Los Angeles, in the LA County Sheriff's Department, in court services, when they found out I could talk, I was the guy that briefed the jurors at West LA Court. Years before that, when I graduated locally here from Mariner High School, I went right to work at Custer Battlefield in Montana, where Custer had his last stand. That's where I learned to really sharpen my public speaking skills, to win over an audience very quickly. And there, because I had a spectacular landscape behind me, I knew how to position myself so that they could look past me and look at what I was pointing to in the distance, like the great bend of the river where the Lakota village was, or to get close and then soften the voice to an audience when you're describing the last 6 or 7 soldiers breaking away from Last Stand Hill and running for their lives, that there were hundreds of Lakota and Cheyenne running after them. You could watch people wilt. So you pick up these things. Table topics is the closest thing we get to in Toastmasters of regularly thinking on your feet, being aware, looking for sight, sound, texture, that can give you ideas to work from.
Great, thank you. It's very layered, isn't it? Thinking about all of the different elements, like your language has to work with the landscape that has to work with the audience that has to work. It's fascinating.
And not being shy, be big. You're
Yeah,
not going to upstage
yeah,
that background.
yeah, that's great. It looks like Kyle has a question for Lee. How do you uncover the stances, posture, movements, and gestures of your characters?
So this goes into doing the preparation for doing Chautauqua. And when I did J. Robert Oppenheimer, I spent about 3.5, 4 years just reading as much as I could, finding humanities scholars that talked about him. And then you also want to read the memoirs of the people in his sphere, because in their memoirs are going to talk probably about you too. So you would look at books by John Adams and James Madison and George Washington as well. You read as much as you can. You try to understand that part of history. And I think our education system in the West, especially here in the U.S., would be so different if they taught history like the way Chris and I were doing it tonight, where you go and you actually tell a story. When you now know that James Madison was my mentee, he was with me in Virginia, he was my Secretary of State, it makes sense why I helped push to make him my successor as the 4th president. You get all that. The Lewis plantation was in eyesight of Monticello. And I watched this young boy going out into the wilderness with just a knife and then coming back. As he grew older, he'd go out into the mountains and stay there for a couple of weeks. So he was my obvious choice when I wanted to explore the West to go get Meriwether Lewis. So, and to give him rank, we got a captain, William Clark, and we made them both a captain. So they equal had clout. Surprisingly, in that encounter, they never encountered any Indians where they had to shoot them. And what was weird is I gave these promissory notes to Meriwether Lewis that if he came across anybody, he can give them, the United States of America is going to give you money. And I'm thinking, what would these Indians be thinking about that? Who are the United States of America? What is money? But to answer the question, you do as much research as you can, and you definitely have to get into their mindset. I think, and I kind of did Thomas Jefferson and J. Robert Oppenheimer about the same time with each one, but I only did Thomas Jefferson recently when you saw it announced in the District 2 Starburst. Was the first time I've ever done it. I've done snippets of being the founding fathers and how this nation was created, but I never came in full regale to do the character. So yeah, you have to kind of learn about the times, and the way they teach history now, it's just all facts and figure dates and data, and it's so boring. They go on to the next event. So we have to know when the war happened, and it doesn't mean anything, but when you hear the personal stories. So when I do J. Robert Oppenheimer, I do a lot of personal stories of the people that were there. And so you start learning how to answer, how you're going to move. And like for J. Robert Oppenheimer, it talks about how he walked. He had this very quirky walk. So when I walk in front of the audience on that one, I do a quirky walk. I've progressed way more from when Christopher first saw me do it. That was the first time I did J. Robert, but it's totally go ahead, Mary Ellen.
Oh, well, I was just thinking about that when you did Oppenheimer, which I saw. You changed your voice, you changed things about yourself so that you fit. So what I was wondering is, were you able to see video of him where you would not be able to see video of Thomas Jefferson? You would have to take it from books or descriptions or whatever.
So I've seen pictures of J. Robert Oppenheimer in books. I've seen some snippets of video, like when he was in the McCarthy hearings, he was tried for communism, and they stripped him from his security clearance. It wasn't until the Bohemian president, John F. Kennedy, was to present him the Enrico Fermi Award on October 23rd. And the day before that, JFK decided to take an open motorcade ride in downtown Dallas. And we know what happened there, right? So he never got the award from JFK, but I read how he walked and how his graduate students just adored him. Women adored him. And he had a real quirky walk. His graduate students began to walk like him. They began to talk like him. Everybody knew him as a very good listener. As you're talking, he's going, yes, 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 yes. And he would ask questions back. So you knew he was actually listening. And people just were endeared to that. So with him, that's what you did. With Thomas Jefferson, it's a little bit harder because there aren't any real photographs or paintings of him. You don't really know how he walked or talked. They really didn't talk about that kind of stuff when they wrote the history books back then. But you got an impression of how he thought, definitely, from reading about him and what other people thought of him. So you just have to do a lot of work and just try to embody what you think this guy was based on what you've heard. Go ahead, Emily.
So one of the other questions I had was, how do you, there must be conflicting stories out there. So how do you choose which parts of your character to embody?
Yeah, so I don't know if I actually came across anything that was really substantially conflicting, but it was well known that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were great friends. But if you knew what happened that riffed them, it was when Thomas Jefferson became president. In the last hours, John Adams wrote up 43 appointments as judges and justices of the peace. And there's one of the most famous of the Supreme Court cases is called Marbury v. Madison. So Marbury was this judge who was supposed to get his papers, and Thomas Jefferson didn't send them. They didn't get sent by John Adams beforehand. And so he went to the Supreme Court and filed a petition. And of course, it went to the Secretary of State, who was James Madison. Well, at this point, it became a very pivotal Supreme Court case because at this point, no one knew if we really had three equal branches of government. And so John Marshall, the Chief Justice, wrote this thing. He said, okay, we have to throw this case out. The Constitution is very clear in its language. You have to have a case that wends its way through the courts. And then if you keep appealing, then it gets to the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court decides to take on that case, they will. And so that became a quintessential Supreme Court case where here's how John Marshall saved face. If he said, Thomas Jefferson, you have to give this appointment. And if Thomas Jefferson just said, no, I'm not going to do it, it would show that the judicial branch did not have equal standing. If he favored in terms of Thomas Jefferson, everybody would have thought he kowtowed to the executive branch of the president. So it was a stroke of genius to be able to say, we can't do this case. It didn't follow the constitutional law. Brilliant. Okay. So what I found was one of the people he didn't appoint was John Quincy Adams to something. And this really, of course, the mother, Abigail Adams, never forgave Thomas Jefferson. Near the end of their life, they had a big span where they did not write letters to each other. They weren't friends anymore. Well, Benjamin Rush, one of the signers, Dr. Benjamin Rush, he couldn't stand to see these two not resolve themselves. So he wrote to each of them saying, hey, John, Thomas wants to reconcile. Hey, Thomas, John wants to reconcile. And he got them talking, and they both said, hey, I don't want to die before I explain myself. And they became friends again. So I'm thinking, why would Thomas have done this to his son unless you didn't know he was one of them, right? So, but they had a rift for a very long time. And I'm thinking, if they were such great friends, they should have been able to. So that's the big one I see. And I've just interpreted that as Leah Matangelo looking at the data of history. How did this happen if they were such great friends? But anyway.
Thank you. I have a question for Phil, and anyone of you might also have the same. The question may apply to anyone. Phil, this is, I think, the second time I've heard this speech. I know it's evolved a bit. How did you go about like refining it to get it to where it is today?
The thing that I have been working on and still want to work on more is making the dogs have more human characteristics at the beginning, and then I'm working with the part that I'm really working on is how to connect those human characteristics to how we became friends. I mean, honestly, even though I knew the dogs beforehand, and we had so it wasn't a complete surprise to me. But I didn't know them well, and then they were kind of annoying, honestly, the times I had been around them. So I wanted to kind of build on that to say that, you know, friendships can develop even when it's awkward at the beginning. To do that, I was trying to give them human characteristics. And I thought with animals, it's a lot of us do that. We give them human characteristics and human emotions and voices and everything. So that's where I'm working on.
This is brilliant. I really enjoyed it. Emmy?
Yeah, I had a thought about that because I have heard this before too, but I'd forgotten that they were dogs. And so I'm listening to it from the point of view of these are your son's roommates. And I thought you did a pretty good job of giving them human qualities. Where I thought it kind of got weak was when you said, "Oh, did I mention these were dogs?" What I thought might work really well is if your son said, "Why don't you take the guys out for a walk?"
Oh,
So they can do their business.
And you're going, "What? What?"
And don't forget to take a bag with you. Like,
Boy, come on, boy. Something like that to say, "Oh, they're dogs." You know?
I suspected they were dogs.
Did
Just
you?
by the language describing it.
Yeah. But it was totally engaging.
One of the things I was thinking about is you said he got right up in your face, and you said that a couple of times, and that I think might have given it away a little bit. One way to disguise that might be to say, you know how most people have a sense of space. They like a sense of space. This guy doesn't have that. He's right up here.
yeah.
And he doesn't have the breath for that.
He didn't brush his teeth.
Yeah.
I have another question. This one would be for Kyle, but I also wanted to make sure others who haven't had a chance to ask yet, if you have any questions for our panelist. Okay, I'll
When
call
you're
on.
done,
Oh, yeah, sure.
when you're done, I have a question for Kyle and for
Great.
for Christopher.
Okay. So for Kyle, and again, anybody is welcome to jump in on this too if you have a response. I noticed that you really had to give a lot of layering to this story to be able to have the two characters. And you even mentioned it, that you kind of had to give them a backstory. How did you kind of go about evolving that?
The Puritan was really obvious. I did grow up in New England, in Rhode Island, where Puritans did land in Massachusetts, and to some degree, some of their values have sunk into the people. And I described it as leaching into your feet growing up. You grow up not realizing you're absorbing certain values, like public nudity is not something that's acceptable. Public nudity is not acceptable. In some parts of New England, you can live next door to somebody for 10 years and never be invited over to their house for coffee or tea or supper or anything, just because they're New Englanders and they don't do that. They'll talk to each other while they're doing the yard work, and other than that, I'm straying off topic. The Puritan was the obvious one. The other one was, I finally decided to call him the dude. I think hippie. I used to call him hippie, but hippie I think has some connotations, and I wasn't around in the '60s. And I think dude, especially when you say it that way, dude, it has a connotation that seems known today. And it's all about just chill out, relax, go with the flow kind of thing. Does that help?
Thank you. Looks like, let's see, no, Phil had one. And then
Well-
Emmy, yeah.
Okay. Following up on that, Kyle, have you ever, when you said that, when you were describing how you were coming up with the voices for the two parts of your subconscious, when you said the dude, my thought went immediately to Fast Times at Ridgemont High, and I think it's Sean Penn, and I thought, wow, if you, wouldn't it be cool if you could really personify that Southern California, be chill dude and hang out. That's where I went. Is that ever, those kind of things ever come to mind when you're developing your characters? Or
I have to confess, I've never seen Fast Times in Ridgemont High. So I've heard.
how can you live?
Oh, you don't like classic movies, Kyle?
Classic.
Yeah, Karen McNamara. I like the prude and the dude. So I've never seen that, but yeah, that I think that character that you're talking about might fit. Mary Ellen had a question, and then I think Christopher.
Yeah, so to my mind, I'm thinking that you don't actually introduce those characters to the audience.
No.
You're just personifying them, and it seemed so obvious to me that when you did give them a character, it made all the difference in the world to how you presented that and how funny it was. It was really much better after you'd given them a character.
Yep.
I wasn't sure. But yeah, it made sense to me that you don't actually introduce that in your speech. You just...
No, I don't. And the prude guy starts calling the other one names, and the dude finally responds by threatening to tell mother. But other than that, other than that, I don't give them names in there, and I don't say that I had these two personalities. I just slip into. I slipped first into the prude character, reacting to this idea of clothing optional, and then the other side, and this dialogue goes on and on and on. And
Lee, please.
Yeah. So did Christopher have a question? I thought you mentioned Christopher. So for Kyle, I thought at one point in your dialogue, so this is an internal dialogue you're having, right? So Thomas Jefferson actually wrote a letter that was an internal dialogue. It was called the Business of the Head and the Affairs of the Heart. And he's writing this love letter to this woman. So you may do something like that. You could have either the Puritan and the Playboy, because I take this guy as being more like late 60s, the Playboy, the free love, and it's like, just chill, man. But what would be cool at the end of the story, I mean, you're totally identified with the Puritan. At the end of the story, I think it would be cool if you go, I think I'm getting in touch with my Playboy side. And then all of a sudden, boom, the audience is thrown.
well, I don't think you've seen this story. It has a very.
No, I saw it. Yeah,
Oh,
I saw when you did it. Yeah.
Okay. And the two of them finally do start talking when the dude mentions, "Hey, we're going to this place. No one knows us. We're completely anonymous." And the prude is like, "What? No one knows us? We're anonymous?"
Hi, Kyle.
Yeah. Thanks, Mary Ellen.
Yeah. Until it's not anonymous. That's right.
I have a question for Christopher. I have been on a number of tours and have always been very attentive to the tour guides, but in listening to your story, I wondered what makes an ideal group for you? So next time I'm going to go on a tour, I'd love to be a person who is so more maybe appreciative of my tour guide.
I would say the ideal size would be 30 to 40.
Oh,
I have done groups much larger than that, but it almost creates an anonymity with them as a group. It's harder for them to respond as a group. Whereas a small crowd of 30 to 40, They're easier to keep track of. And by how you position yourself, how you engage them, how you get close to them at the right moment, that can give them a kind of crowd character that you can play with, you can work with, especially if they speak your language. Now, when you're giving a tour to people that don't speak your language, they have an interpreter. Automatically, I have to cut everything in half because I have to be back in a certain amount of time for the next tour. I can't crowd out everybody else just because of my group. So I take the most obvious things for that. And it makes it easy for the interpreter. Sometimes the interpreters aren't that apt. So you have to work with your interpreter early on. Make it simple so what he says is simple. Ideal group, I'd say mornings are a good time. The people who show up first for the first tour of the day usually really want to go. Later in the day, they're tired, or just after lunch, they are digesting. But they'll be at their skills, even though in the morning they might be a little sleepy. Or let's say they're a group that comes from overseas and they're jet lagged. If you're a guide, don't be embarrassed if sometimes people fall asleep during your presentation. It happens. They're just tired. But the ideal group would be 30 to 40.
I have a question for Christopher, if I may. Christopher, I have stood on that balcony and looked out over the cavern of that factory floor. I want to know whether you've ever anthropomorphized what's going on there, and or describe what's going on there in terms of animals. I guess anthropomorphizing is the other way around. For instance, I would imagine the engineers swarming over a jet would look like ants on a carcass.
You are a good 200 feet away from the jets. Your balcony view, you're as if you were on a giant cliff looking out. First thing, when they come out of the elevator, it's overwhelming. So you immediately take charge of it by saying, yes, you are right. I affirm you, you're right in being amazed. Let them breathe a moment to take it all in. And then start the big general things. Look at these long lines. Here on the balcony, we can look from one end of the factory to the other. Then when it gets to the people down below, let's say on the giant crawler robot that carries the head and tail of a 777, I can point out and single them out. Look at those individual people. For them to function, each person that's putting something on the jet has to be supported by thousands of others. Buyers, planners, transport people that get those millions of parts here in a condition we can use. It's the daily miracle of the Boeing factory to get the right part at the right time, for the right order, and still have a backup plan in case something doesn't show up on time. So going from general to particular, giving them something to look at and watch where they are looking. And early on, you have discovered by working the audience at the beginning of your presentation, with a few jokes, you can find out who laughs. That means those are the people that understand the language well, that are quick about it. And if they don't laugh at the right times, from experience, you know what gets a reaction. That tells you you need to simplify what you're doing.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
It's more of a comment, because what I was going to ask is, how do you keep it interesting for all different groups? And you just said you watch how they're responding, and yeah.
I also have a giant repertoire of stories. I myself, ever since I was a child, I was less interested in the technical stuff so much as the people who are working on it.
Mm.
By this, you make it human and approachable. The relation between the person who's building and that vast, beautiful thing that they are making. That's where giving that thing of metal a character. You see the cheeks on the 747, the smile on the 767. Look at that tall forehead. It could swallow you up, and yet this is this modern marvel that protects us when we go 30,000 feet. If my cell phone fails, it only falls 3 feet. If my jet fails, you fall 30,000 feet. So it's got to be just so.
Indeed. Looks like we have time for one more question. Someone had one? Going, gone. So I would like to take a couple of extra minutes just to ask people if they have a takeaway before I call on the general evaluator. Do you have something that you are taking away tonight, either collectively or a specific thing from any one of the speakers? Just take maybe 30 seconds. So I'll go Lee, ME, and then Kyle.
I learned a lot from Christopher. He didn't really mention this, but his voice is very interesting, the way he speaks, and it commands you to listen. And the personification of the objects was incredible. And just in the setting he was saying, I mean, it's all very orchestrated to give an experience, and that's how you do storytelling. Right? So thank you, Christopher.
Okay, then I think ME and Kyle.
I really enjoyed the difference between the characterization. They all did it differently. And so that inspires me to just sort of make things my own, but to put more characterization into what I do. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Kyle.
I think I've learned a little from everybody, but the thing I'm taking away, I've seen Christopher's storytelling for years, and I've always loved his storytelling. But what I didn't know about was I've never given the same presentation to an audience over and over and over and over and over again. So where I had the chance to start to learn some of the skills he's talking about. Oh, if I tell a joke at the beginning, I can gauge how well they understand my language. That had never occurred to me. What a useful speaking tool. Oh, if there's a translator, if they're being translated, I better cut my content in half. I haven't had that situation. It never occurred to me. And that's one of the things I'm going to have to think about if I start presenting, overseas. I have presented overseas via Zoom, but I made sure they knew I was monolingual and that it wasn't going to be a problem.
And you never know, since I don't speak another language, how they are actually translating you, because they seem to take a lot longer than what I say. That's why I trim it short. In other words, if I'm making a joke, I can just imagine them saying, "Your tour guide is making a joke." Laugh uproariously. Joke is completed.
Mhm.
That would be kind of funny. Oh my gosh. All right. So let's see that we've had 3 people. Karen?
Well, I'll give my comments in the general evaluation.
Okay, perfect. So that leaves Phil, Christopher, and Cynthia. Something that you might be taking away tonight.
I'm very pleased to see especially Kyle and Lee. I've not seen you in many years. And Zoom allows for all sorts of interesting variations. You folks make good use of your Zoom. That's the thing. Remember, your camera there is your real serious audience.
Right.
So be aware how to make use of it.
Right. Hey, Phil, I think I saw you just blink. I thought for a moment you had frozen, but there you go.
My takeaway is I think from from Christopher that we can even assign human characteristics to objects on the assembly line, even objects that are often thought of as cold and without emotion. They can have emotions, they can have wishes and desires just like us, or at least in our story and our presentation of that thing, we can assign those to them. So that's what my takeaway is, that even something that is an idea or a piece of metal can have those characteristics in order to make our point.
Great. Cynthia.
I think my takeaway is from Lee, how you embody your character. To embody, it must be harder to embody a real live person or somebody that was alive than it is, just doing it for yourself.
I'm gonna do a dead person next time, so we'll see.
Well, you kind of are doing a dead person.
It's only harder if you care to do it realistically.
Thank you, Cynthia. For myself, I've said this, but I want to be more specific about how appreciative I am of all the panelists, because specifically, I learned really 4 different approaches to being able to bring a character to life, whether that began with Phil and it was to humanize something that's kind of inhuman, the animals, which are very popular. A real way to connect with an audience is through pets or through animals, and it makes it work cross-culturally too. It doesn't matter who your audience is. Having a pet is very around the world, it works. So I loved how you made your dogs human and thought you did it masterfully. From Kyle, that inner dialogue is always going on with me. So to use that as characters, it's, you don't have to go, I don't have to go outside myself to create characters. They're all in me. And just different versions of me. And for Christopher, I really appreciate how you both gave me 2 things. One, how the scenery, like I can't what did you say? I can't
I can't be bigger than what big thing is around me.
Right.
I
Okay.
can't upstage.
You can't upstage the scenery, and then the way that you gave made something emotional, an emotional connection, the smile with the things that people were seeing to make them that kind of a connection. And then for Lee, I think Cynthia just mentioned this, but to take and own your character so completely, to be in that person's skin, whether my character, like you make it the entire presentation is the character, but even at a smaller portion, if I could embody a different character. And Kyle kind of did that with the prude and the dude, even if he didn't name them. So thank you all for that. It was phenomenal. I really love when panels come together and everybody has such a unique perspective on bringing characters, giving characters in speeches and presentations. So it was wonderful. A joy to moderate. We now can segue to our feedback portion of the meeting, and that is led tonight by Karen McNamara. Karen, take it away.
Thank you, Mary, Madam Moderator. And I just want to verify how much time I have, because looking at the agenda, I thought we're out of time. So I want to see.
No, you're fine. You have 5 minutes.
I have 5 minutes. Okay. So I want to echo what Mary just said in that this was a great evening of giving 4 examples of how to bring a character to life. Phil, you showed us how to describe characters and then do it in a story format with a surprise ending. That's a very powerful way to bring characters and make a connection with the audience. I think it would be possible to name them earlier on. Have your son introduce them. Hey, this is Tank and Marcus, and then all of a sudden, then just start describing how they come across and you into your space and all those kind of things, and it could bring the character right away. You might try some of those things. And then Kyle, I absolutely loved your evolution of your inner dialogue, because I think all of us do that to some degree, and you demonstrated it as well as talking about it. You did your initial way of telling your story and your characters, and then you talked about your dialogue, actually creating the dialogue, and then you really turned it up in the third phase. And I think that's very powerful. And each time you did it, I related to it more. I could connect more with the characters, and I could feel them stronger. I could identify with them. And I think you could potentially name them Prude and Dude. You could even say the names. There's nothing wrong with that, because we make an association. It's about connecting with the audience and making that association. So I think it would be okay to say that too. And the reason I said Prude and Dude was because they rhyme. And that's another way of remembering things. And so that's what ran through my mind as you were doing it. But I think that inner dialogue that we have is so powerful, and we all get it. Although I read a research study recently where some people don't have an inner dialogue, I can't even imagine it. But supposedly that there are a few out there that fall in that category. And then Christopher, I loved your comments about the importance of timing and change, and knowing that your audience will vary. Even if it's the same story, you have to flex with it. You have to recognize that. I know when I do a keynote, one of my favorite things to do, if it's possible, I don't know my audience in advance, is I wander with them. I just chat with them, and I don't even necessarily introduce myself up front. I just listen. Like you highlighted the importance of listening. Maybe they all got stuck in traffic on the way in, and they're just still spun over that. Well, you can use that to your advantage when you start to talk, to connect with the audience. And the whole idea of taking an inanimate object and making it a character or bringing it to life, the way we remember things is by pictures, converting something into a picture. So every time I see a 767 now, I'm going to think of the smile. And because I remember that, I made that connection, and a 764 is the high forehead, and it rhymes, and you can do those things and remember them. And I think that making those connections, the listening and the gathering and the using the ideas of the color and the texture and the movement were all very powerful. And it was a great way to bring something inanimate into life, because you just don't know. And like you say, across cultures. I did a presentation a couple of weeks ago where I had 7 countries and 4 different generations all represented. And I was talking about communicating across cultures and generations. So it was a really interesting experience, and it was very powerful, and I learned a ton, in doing that. And it's using some of the things you talked about. And then Lee, I always appreciate when you come in the form of the character. When you dress the character, you show the character, you live the character, and you know the character story and how they would respond. When we asked you questions, you just immediately continued with your character and spoke how they would have spoken. And it comes right down to, as you said, doing the research, doing the study and learning. And it's not something that happens in an hour. It's something you did over years to really get into that character. I liken it to when you have an actor having to become that person. I mean, you spoke about that too, Christopher, having when you are actually doing the acting, when you're actually taking a role, you have to get into that role. And that is one of the most powerful ways of getting a message across, is by becoming that person, because you remember and you get to know that person. I hated history growing up, hated it. And I never related to it. I thought it was stupid. I thought, why should I learn something that happened in the past? That's just a waste of my time. We're now and we're in the future. We're not in the past. And when I finally in high school, or maybe it was actually my last year of junior high, I had a history teacher who played the role. and started talking the character. And he then, as soon as he would do that, he would relate it to today and say, here's how this relates to today. All of a sudden, I was so mad that I hadn't paid attention in history because I realized I'd missed so much, because now I hadn't learned from the past and brought it to the future and brought it to the present. And you did a really good job of talking about in your time and making that differentiation, so we knew that you were not speaking in the same time frame. And that was very powerful. So I did thoroughly enjoy that. And I think that you pulled all of those key pieces together really well. I think it's a great way to teach as well as to speak. I think it's a real learning experience for all. And so I thank all of you for bringing these different components of character to life. I think it's so important, and probably one of the most powerful things that we can do in storytelling is the use of characters and becoming those characters. So I now will call on Cynthia to tell us about our timing and how we did.
Thank you. If we were doing contests, we would all fail. We kind of all went over time, except Phil. He was 6 minutes and 57 seconds. Kyle was 7 minutes and 44 seconds. Christopher was 10 minutes on the nose. And TJ, or the dead guy, was 13 minutes and 31 seconds.
Thank you. And with that, I will just say that we started on time, and Mary kept us moving and got everyone to speak and everyone to participate. And that's a key thing in a moderator. And with that, I will now turn it back to Mary, who then I guess turns it over to the president. Okay.
Indeed. I will conclude this character study of characters for Lab Storymasters. It was masterful. Thank you all for your participation and your contributions for tonight's meeting.